Hey, welcome to The Feast Life, where we empower you, the modern homeschool mom, to create a life and homeschool you love. I'm Julie Ross, the creator of the award-winning curriculum A Gentle Feast, a homeschool veteran of over 20 years, and a certified Christian life coach. Charlotte Mason said, life should be all living, not a mere tedious passing of time. So on this show, we seek to savor the feast of life. So go get your favorite beverage and pull up a chair. You're welcome at this table. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Feast Life podcast. I am so excited today to get to interview Nicole Cottrell. Did I say it right? Okay. She's of color, and I have been a big fan of hers for a long time and following her Instagram account and all the wonderful posts that she does and the books that she recommends. And I'm like, girl, I have got to have you come and share your wisdom with my audience. So thank you so much, Nicole, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited.
Yeah, so those of my listeners who have not heard of Stories of Color, can you just give a little kind of intro of what that is?
Yeah, sure. Stories of Color, currently, it's an online resource with hosting about over 3,000 books now of diverse living books. People can search using really amazing search options and filters that let you find exactly the book you're looking for. So you can search by history, time period, genre, grade, all kinds of things. And we have a lot of other resources on there as well in terms of how to help add diversity to your homeschool, centered around a Charlotte Mason education.
Yeah, I love your search features. Did you all build that yourself?
No, I wish we host all of the data on a software called Airtable. And that's what lets us do the fancy searching and have all those filter options. And then we host that inside of our site. So my husband is really my team member and he does all of that back end stuff. And thankfully, because it's not my expertise. So I find the books and do all the other things. And then he helps me on the backside.
Oh, that's sweet. That's really neat that you guys get to do that together.
Yeah.
So what was like your inspiration for, hey, let's start this site?
I grew up, so I'm biracial. I have a Black dad and a white mom, and I grew up in public school like a lot of people and didn't have the best, I would say, history education and literature education in some aspects. There were definitely some holes and gaps. But my Black family was really good at making sure I was learning things outside of school. So they sent me to museums and camps and gave me books, listened to music, studied artists. And when I started homeschooling, I just thought, oh, those resources are going to be there. That's just naturally going to be a part of my experience with my kids. And then I quickly learned that wasn't the case. And I was having to spend a lot of time researching, finding books, finding resources, pulling in from different places to create what I would consider just a more holistic and representative kind of education for my kids. And over time, my friends started asking me like, oh, Nicole, do you know a book from 1800s on these indigenous people from, and I'm like, yeah, I do. And I would loan the book or I'd give them the title. And I remember complaining to my husband, I was like, gosh, I wish there was a website that had all of these books in one place so people could just search and find them. And he was like, you should do that. And I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. Years go by, I'm still grumbling about it. And then one day he says to me, hey, I think I found the software that would let you do the thing you want to do. I think we could host all these books in one place. And we just started brainstorming and took off from there.
That is beautiful. That is so great that you saw a need and for yourself and your family. And then you're like, yes, I want to bless other people as well. And how long has it been up?
A little over 2 years now. And really, it did start very much to scratch an itch of my own. Like I wanted it, and then I actually use it myself, which I know sounds maybe silly to people, but like I do my school planning using Stories of Color. And yeah, it hasn't been around, I guess, that long. But I feel like we've done a lot in a little with just a 2-person team. And so, yeah.
That's what I was going to ask you, because that is a lot of books to curate.
Yeah.
So how do you go about, have you read all 3,000? Like, how do you go about this kind of thing?
Yeah, I definitely have not read all 3,000 plus books. The vetting process is such a good question, and it's such an important one. Of course, because I am a Charlotte Masoner, although I know that a lot of users aren't Charlotte Masoners, and a lot of homeschoolers aren't Charlotte Masoners, but they're still looking for these quality living books. A book has to be living. Of course, we probably all have maybe a little bit of variance in what defines but we know it when we see it. That's what I always say. When you open and read a living book, you know it's a living book. So that's the first thing. Generally, my goal is for books to be written by authors of color, although I would say I think it's about 70, I think it's maybe 75% right now of the titles are written by people of color. That's the first lead, but that's not a requirement by any means. And then from there, I take my time to read reviews that are written by either the organizations that represent those books. So if it's an Indigenous children's title or a African American children's title, for example, I will read the reviews from those groups that represent those titles. And then, of course, I do try to get my hands on books if at all possible, and at least look inside of them. But I have not read every single book, of course. No, I wish, but no.
Well, especially if it's just two of you. That's what I was wondering. I'm like, did she like book elves over there?
That would be amazing. I wish I could just spend my days in my bed reading, but no, unfortunately, it's not in the cards.
Do you feel like there are more books accessible for families to more diversity than there have been? And
yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good question. I think there are. I think every year we're seeing more titles being published that are more diverse. However, because Charlotte Mason is Charlotte Mason, and for those of us that use her philosophy, we do still all tend to lean towards like older books and classic books, right? So I think one of the challenges is for us to say a classic doesn't automatically mean has to be read. And Charlotte Mason education doesn't mean that we exclude newer titles, right? Charlotte herself was using new titles at the time. She actually was embracing, she was this rogue agent in so many ways. It's one of the things I love and relate to about her. And she wasn't scared to do that. And I think it's just good to be mindful and remember that our education can look a lot like a mix of those things. It doesn't have to be one or the other. And one thing I mention to people is when we think about the scope of history, we know that for hundreds and then maybe even thousands of years, depending on the people group, certain stories just weren't even being told. They didn't have access to be telling those stories. So we're still playing catch up. And then we have the rest of history where those titles are now being filled in the modern era. And so those are the books that we've been looking for that we can now plug into our history studies because they're available to us now.
Yeah, it makes me think. I just recently went on a history tour of Charleston, South Carolina. It's like for untold stories of women of Charleston or something like that.
Yeah.
Stories were just amazing. And I'm like, how come I never heard of this lady?
Yeah.
And it's like, well, these stories weren't told.
Yeah, that's one of the phrases we use a lot in stories of color is untold and undertold stories. And we have opportunity now to help those stories be told. And so it's an exciting time for children's literature in that way and for homeschool as a whole.
Yeah, definitely. So if I want to get started with this process, but there's 3,000 books. How do I go about adding more diversity into what we're already doing in our home?
That's a good question too. I would say, I think books are one of the easiest ways. There are a few subjects that just naturally lend themselves really easily to adding in and subbing in some titles from maybe people that look differently from your family. Geography, of course, is one that instantly comes to mind. And that's an easy one. But I really love starting with like art and music. An artist study, there's not always a direct artist to plug in for a certain time period, but a lot of times there are. If we just look outside of what we, again, would consider fine art, plugging in artist studies, there's a resource I love, the study of color. No, that's not right. Something like that, which it'll come to me. But my friend Erica Alicia's resource, and she and her friend have developed these beautiful multicultural artist studies that are in the vein of Charlotte Mason. Adding in composers of color, that's a really great and easy way to begin, and then finding books around those people. And then, of course, history, literature, read alouds. So much of our read aloud lists are like classic book lists. And so sometimes is there room to add in a book that you maybe wouldn't have considered before? And that would be really rich in addition to your family. And then we talk a lot about do things that maybe visit a multicultural center near you, make a recipe that's outside of what you traditionally eat from somewhere you're studying, interview someone, talk to someone who represents a people group that's not your own, those kinds of things. And those, of course, are such great ways to add richness to whatever it is you're reading.
Yeah, those are really great tips. I like that you touched on some things that were outside of the box and it wasn't just, I think history and literature and geography come up.
Yeah. Right.
But
yeah.
widening that scope a little bit to, diversifying your morning time or we do read louds in the afternoon. But I also love this idea of finding what is in your local community.
Mhm.
I feel like it's those real life people connections that
Yes, absolutely.
impact us the most. We read the book Brown Girl Dreaming by Jacqueline Woodson.
Mhm. I love that book.
Town had her come and speak, and then
Oh,
they had
wow.
an open forum where people could get up and
That's
just,
amazing.
I know it was amazing. And there are these women in their 60s and 70s just sharing stories of how they weren't allowed to go into this store. They could only go in
Mhm.
that door, and what it was
Yeah.
like being able to swim in the neighborhood pool.
Wow.
And I didn't grow up in South Carolina, so it was just very wide opening for me. But
Yeah.
for my kids, that was so different than their scope.
Right.
But when they actually heard a real person, it wasn't
Yeah.
just on a history page or you're reading like a
Right.
character that you can relate to, but not really. But it's those in-person connections which are so important. So I'm so glad
Yeah.
you brought that up. That's really cool. So Charlotte Mason, talks about living books. And so what's the kind of role of the living books in bridging this gap? And
Yeah. I think Charlotte did talk a lot more about diversity than people maybe realize, at least for her time period and what she was facing. The fact that she talks about not raising insular children who don't know the histories of other and know the language and the stories, the poets of other countries. She specifically talked about that. And I think part of that is understanding what her intention was if we're following this philosophy. But I really do think that living books serve as they're windows and mirrors. And I know a lot of us hear that phrase. That's Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop, and who coined that term. And then Amber O'Neill Johnson, currently of Heritage Mom Blog, she's really carried the mantle of talking about books as windows and mirrors. But living books, I think, are some of the best ways that we can have and open up for our children. Here is something that looks like you, whatever your story is, that's a mirror that's being held up to you. That's so critically important for children to see themselves reflected in their stories. But also as windows, that here's a book where you're getting to see into someone else's life that doesn't look like you, who hasn't had the same experiences as you. Those are the connections that build empathy, that build compassion, that help us raise people that go out into the world and are mindful, right? And are these like holistic thinkers that know that their story isn't the only story, right? And they have a different way of operating in the world. And so I think living books are one of the best tools for doing that. It does require, we were talking about this kind of blend of stories and blend of old and classic and perhaps new and modern and somewhere in the middle, which is, of course, it takes intentionality, but I think it gives us the best opportunity to help raise kids like that. And yeah, I don't think there's another tool quite like it to be able to do that.
Hey everyone, Julie Ross here. I just wanted to pop in and let you know about something special that I am doing. Starting May 7th, I will be doing a free 3-day workshop called The Gentle Art of Homeschooling. So you may have chosen to homeschool because you want to give your children the gift of an education that looks vastly different from our modern education system. You know, the one of checking off all the boxes, cramming in all the facts, and the one-size-fits-all mentality. You long for connections, deep discussions, and a slower pace of life. You want your children to develop good character, critical thinking, and a love for learning. But all the different curriculum options and educational philosophies and all those voices are making your head spin. And you wish you could just have someone take your hand and guide you through it all. Well, now you can. Join me for 3 days for this free workshop. I have helped thousands of families walk through the gentle art of homeschooling, and I would love to share what I have learned with you as well. So to sign up, go to thefeastlife.me/gentle to save your seat. And join me for 3 days where I will show you how to fill your homeschool with creativity, curiosity, and connection. Again, that's thefeastlife.me/gentle. Yeah, exactly. You can read a textbook, you're not going to find something that's going to build empathy. That it's stories that connect us as humans. And Charlotte hit the nail on the head, right? And so
Yeah.
and then we get to use amazing tools like the one you made to make it easier for us, so we're not having to read through stacks of thousands.
Yeah. Ideally, yes, exactly.
And oftentimes you can go to the library and you can see a name or see a cover and go, oh yeah, I'm going to try this. And then you get home and you're like, this isn't living, or this is containing stuff that we don't value. And so to navigate the world of young adult literature these days, it's like a mind.
It's getting more and more complicated for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you mind if we talk about that for a second? Because I, as a curriculum curator, I'll get stacks of books and I'm like, okay, so I want to add, some more diversity into this time period. I do a good job with this, but I don't have any books about this subject. So let me go find some. And oftentimes I find like with books that are written in the past, even 5 years, they are a little bit more direct sometimes with describing things that older books might have glossed over or didn't describe or those kind of things. And I don't know if they're making any sense. I'm trying to be like vague, but also to get my point across. And so it's hard because I'll be reading it and they'll be like, oh, no, we can't talk about that if it's something that I'm requiring a family to read. So, okay, cross that one off the list. But as a parent, it's a little different because you can make those decisions based on what you feel comfortable having discussions about. Just to give you an example, one that I've been reading this past week was the Own a Judge book about the enslaved woman that escaped from the Washingtons. And in the book, several times it mentions like some things that would happen to young slave girls with their owners and things. And so it was like, oh, wow, okay, wasn't expecting that in there. And as a parent, I totally feel comfortable having those conversations because those kind of things happened in the Bible, right? And so we've discussed what that means, and we can have those discussions with my kids are all teens now and middle school age, but as a curriculum person, I couldn't include something like that. How do you as a parent navigate this? I want to include these books, but they might have some things that are going to be hard to talk about.
Yeah, I think that's so good. Firstly, I would say this is just purely my personal experience. And so many of us, I think, will relate to this. All three of my children are so different. I have a child who is very sensitive to any kind of violence or anything dark. It's a no matter what. I have a child who's in the middle, who can handle it, but doesn't want to be overwhelmed by it, of course. And then I have a child who is very truth-minded and justice-minded and is tell me all the things because this is how I feel better in the world. Yes. So I honestly am very, we know that we have these kids who have they're their own people. Yes. And so I do spend different amount of time looking at certain books, some that I would maybe give to one child that I wouldn't give to another, and certain topics that I would maybe high level discuss with one child, but not get into the details of. I think some of that is just being discerning with as a parent with your own children and knowing what they are able to process. Then it is, of course, to a personal family value and decision. There are certain topics we just don't discuss, excuse me, that are off the table, or books, I should say, that are off the table. But then I know other families for whom they're willing to talk about those things and they're open to having those conversations. So it's some of that as well. And then also, I'm not afraid to give my kids a book and say, we're going to skip this part. We're not going to read this section. If you have questions, you can come talk to me, or if I'm reading something with them, I have no problem skipping things. When it comes to things like derogatory language, if we're using an older book, for example, I'll explain what the word means, talk about why it's wrong, and then I just won't use it again if it's used in the book.
Yeah, okay. I was going to ask you about that too. So,
an example, the word savage is used in a lot of Indigenous children's literature or older books, which would have been common vernacular then. We wouldn't use that today, obviously. And so we've talked about why that word was used, why they used it in books then, and then we don't use it as we're reading forward. So I'm not erasing it, and I want to address it. That's the way I handled those things. But yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to your kids, your personal family values, what you're willing to discuss and talk about. And it is definitely different as a curriculum to be able to just say, here's this book. Yeah, because you can't do that. But yeah, we have a little room and discernment that we get to exercise.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you. And that's what makes, I think, my job so difficult sometimes, but I love it. I'm gonna read something like that, or we love this book, or and so I'm trying to hit the middle here most of the time. It's like skip page 7. Like I'll put notes, but like the rest of the book is very good. But and there's somewhere there's too many of these, so this is on the shelf, but I could put it in the free reads and put a note that you're gonna like it first, and only some kids might like it and some kids might not like it. But I'm glad you addressed some of those older books, because one, I think people got this perception that Charlotte Mason only read, if you use the Charlotte Mason education, you can only read old books. And I'm so glad you brought the point of, no, she was using the most recently published books at her time period that were available. And most, I would say almost 90% right, of the books she had available at her time didn't include any diversity at all,
Right.
because they weren't being.
Right. Exactly.
Had to pick from what she could pick from, and
Right.
but we have different options today
Mhm.
us to include
Yeah.
that she wasn't able to. But that doesn't mean we can't still use some of these classics. So how
Mhm.
do you kind of discern, oh, this is a book I'm gonna read and maybe edit, or this is one that just needs to go back
Yeah.
to.
There are a few titles that I've picked up over the years that are on classic lists, and I've started them, and even sometimes my kids have been like, what? And we start and we just realize, we just know that it's either I'm having to, you know, substitute too many things, or there's too much bias or stereotype thinking, that we just put those books aside. Again, that's a personal decision. I know families who will read books that are old that have some of that in them and throughout, and they've chosen to either just talk about it every time or edit that out or whatever is their decision. But for me, it's if it reaches the point of it's tiresome for me to have to continually say, actually,
Yeah.
this would have been used then, but now it's not, to me, that's not worth it, especially when I know that there are so many excellent titles that have been written since that would fill that space that where that wouldn't be necessary. And also it does really depend, but one of my personal hopes is that I'm choosing books that are written by the people group that they're about. That can't always happen, and I know that's not always possible, but that's the ideal, right? If I'm reading about the Pullman train car strike of Black Pullman, and I want to read a book by a Black author. That is my preference for that time period. Are there lots of books written by white authors in that? Of course. Are they excellent? I'm sure there are. But if I can find one written by a Black author, that's always going to be my preference. So that's one thing too that I try to do. And that's not perfect either. And there are plenty of really great books written by white authors about people of color, and those are on Stories of Color site as well. So it's not a hard and fast rule, but it is my ideal.
Yeah. Can you explain a little bit about how the homeschooling landscape has changed in the past several years?
Yeah, post 2020, or I guess through 2020, there's been a huge shift in homeschool community. I think some statistics say there's 3 times more Black homeschoolers now than there had been, which is a huge number.
A very
I know,
short window, like I don't
very
know.
short window.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a huge number. And I think one thing and that's just Black families, it doesn't include like Latino families, Asian families, Indigenous families, those and all of those numbers are on the rise. I think one thing to remember too is that homeschoolers of color have always been here. I mean, we have always been homeschooling, but perhaps now more visibly and definitely in higher numbers. And I'm just really excited about that because for lots of reasons. But I think one of the things when we talk about spreading a feast is inherently diverse, right? A feast means there are lots of things on the table that we get to choose from, and there's richness, and there's culture, and there's heritage, and there's history. And it means that more people have a seat at the table. And ideally, that we're sharing it and sitting at that table together. We're learning from each other. We're learning from each other's experiences. We're listening to each other. There's going to be, and I've seen some of those shifts already within curricula, making adjustments and wanting to add in more diversity to homeschool conventions and conferences and co-ops and all these spaces where they're making room. And I think that they should be. And I'm excited to see how that's going to look in the next 5-10 years for the homeschool community as a whole. It's only going to be better and richer. We're all going to be better for it. Yeah. So I'm excited. Yeah.
That is so exciting. Yeah, I feel because I've been homeschooling 20 years. And I think at first it was very insular of the homeschool community. And so down on some of those connections that we would have made. Mm-hmm. Our kids were in school, the neighbor, right. And everybody was put together. And so I just love that. I love that. And of course, I love the feast metaphor. And this concept of everybody has this, and the way I close my podcast is everyone has a seat at the table. Yeah. And so I love that that's what the homeschool community is becoming. And I think it's going to be a process for sure. Yeah. But it's so beautiful. And that our kids get to see that. Mm-hmm. And that there's a different way for the world that can operate. Yes. Where everybody's welcome. And that's so encouraging. Yes. I'm excited about it too. Yeah, it's and great. So I appreciate you creating what you have, because I feel like this has opened the door for so many families. Mm-hmm. Accessible and not to be so overwhelming, and that you offer it and it's free. And people can just go, and it's so easy to use. It is really such a gift. And I pray that you and your family are just Thank you. Blessed for
Yeah, thank you.
well
Yeah.
done.
Yes.
Really, I really mean that. I know it has been a sacrifice of love and time and
Yeah, it is a labor of love. And I think when I have families message me and say, you've made it so much easier for me to find this book and now our homeschool looks different. And then I have families that message me and say, you made it so easy for me to find books that look like our family. That both of those are so significant, and that's what I wanted. And it is a gift. It's a gift to me. So I love doing it.
thank you. And do you have any last words of encouragement or wisdom for our families that are listening today about how they can continue to add some more stories of color into their lives?
Oh, words of encouragement. I think starting small and not feeling like you have to do everything all at once, just like anything, especially when we're homeschooling, we put a lot of pressure on ourselves, and it doesn't have to be that way. But starting small, starting with one book here or there that you might otherwise not have included, can really begin to shift and help bring about some great conversations with your kids and open up other ideas. And we're saying we're all richer for it, and it's meant to be fun as well. And one thing I would say too is, don't feel like the stories you have to add have to be stories that are like only the like oppression and the hard stuff and the sad stuff. Read about joyful things. Read about inventors of color and scientists of color and artists and people who are doing beautiful things in the world that weren't just living difficult lives. Because those stories are really important, and those have to be included as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. I think just even the literature landscape has very much
Mhm.
changed too. So
Yes. Yes.
historical fiction that has changed. It's
Right.
just books about kids playing in the neighborhood and anything now, like, and then
Yeah.
that's fun too, just to try to include some of those, because I think it's a really good point that it's
Yeah.
not all this dark hardship kind of books that you're including about hard topics like the Pullman strike you were talking about, but the fun and the joy and the connection and the family and seeing them everyone living their ordinary lives.
Yes. It's so important.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate
Thank you,
it.
Julie.
Everybody find out more about Stories of Color.
Thanks.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you liked this episode, please heart it down below and make sure you subscribe so you never miss an episode. Leave a comment and let me know what you learned in today's episode. I'd love to hear from you.